The dirt road leading to Earl Peterson's farm had seen better decades. By 2019, the gravel was more dust than stone, and the two tractors sitting in his equipment shed told the story of a man caught between two generations of farming. One was green, a 1965 Farmall 806 that had pulled his father's plow through the same black Iowa soil for 50 years. The other was red, a 2018 Massey Ferguson 5713 that sat wrapped in plastic, keys still in the dealer's envelope, waiting for a decision that would define whether Earl's farm survived another winter. The county had opinions. Every farmer within 30 miles had an opinion. Some said Earl was a fool for even considering the swap. Others said he was a fool for waiting this long to make it. But nobody expected what he actually did. This is not a story about nostalgia. This is not a story about brand loyalty. This is a story about a man who looked at the numbers, ignored the noise, and made a choice that nearly cost him everything before it saved what remained. The Peterson farm had been in the family since 1952. 3 generations, 240 acres of corn and soybean rotation that had fed families through droughts, floods, and market crashes that wiped out neighbors on both sides of the county line. Earl's grandfather bought the farm all new. His father ran it until his hands couldn't grip the steering wheel anymore. And Earl? Earl inherited both the land and the machine, along with a debt load that grew heavier every planting season. By 2018, the Farmall was showing its age. Not in the way that matters to collectors at auction blocks, but in the way that matters to men who depend on machinery to put food on tables. The engine burned oil like it was going out of style. The hydraulics leaked onto the concrete floor faster than Earl could wipe them up. And the parts? The parts were becoming ghosts. You could order them, sure, but delivery times stretched from weeks to months, and when they arrived, they often didn't fit right because the manufacturing tolerances had changed over 60 years of production gaps. The Massey Ferguson sat in the shed as an alternative. Earl had test-driven it at the dealer's lot in October, felt the power, felt the comfort, felt what modern engineering could do when it wasn't fighting against 6 decades of wear. But the price tag sat in his mind like a stone, $47,000. More than the Farmall had cost new, adjusted for inflation. More than Earl's net operating margin for 2 full growing seasons. His banker had recommendations. His neighbors had recommendations. The dealer had recommendations. But Earl Peterson had something else. He had experience. And experience told him that sometimes the right decision doesn't look right on paper until it's too late to change course. 3 months before Earl made his decision, the county held its annual equipment auction. It was the kind of event that drew farmers from 5 states, the kind where reputations were made and broken in the span of a single bid. Earl attended, as he always did, not to buy but to watch, to learn, to understand where the market was moving before he committed his own capital. What he saw that day would haunt him through the winter. A farmer from the next county over, let's call him Jim, had fallen behind on payments. The bank called in the note. The auctioneer called the equipment to the block, and the crowd watched as Jim's entire operation was sold off piece by piece, lot by lot, until nothing remained but the house and the land that couldn't be moved. Jim's tractor was a John Deere, 5 years old, low hours, pristine condition by any reasonable standard. But the crowd didn't care about condition. They cared about value. They cared about what they could resell for when their own operations hit rough water. And what they understood, in that cold auction yard logic, was that certain brands held value better than others. Certain brands could be parted out. Certain brands had parts availability that stretched decades into the future. The Deere sold for $32,000. A Massey Ferguson of similar age and condition, 2 lots later, sold for $38,000, $6,000 difference. On equipment that was functionally equivalent in the field, Earl stood in the back of the crowd and did the math. $6,000 wasn't just a number. It was seed for 40 acres. It was fertilizer for a full season. It was the difference between making a payment and missing one. It was survival. But here's what the auction didn't tell him. Here's what nobody in that crowd understood until it was too late. Resale value means nothing if the machine doesn't run when you need it to run. And running, really running, requires more than a brand name on the hood. Jim lost his farm that day, not because he bought the wrong brand, not because he made a bad equipment decision, but because he leveraged everything he had against a market that turned against him, and when the turn came, his equipment couldn't carry the load. Earl drove home from that auction with a question burning in his mind. Not which brand to buy, not which dealer to trust, but whether the Farmall, the machine that had carried 3 generations, could carry one more. And if it couldn't, what was he actually willing to sacrifice to replace it? Rural Iowa runs on coffee shop conversations. Every morning at 6, the same 12 men gather at the Main Street diner in town. Same booths, same orders, same topics rotated through the seasons. Planting in spring, weather in summer, harvest in fall, equipment in winter. Earl sat in booth 4, always had, always would, and on a Tuesday morning in January, with snow piled against the windows and the heater rattling like an old engine, the conversation turned to him. "Heard you're looking at new iron," said Walt, a man who'd been farming longer than Earl had been alive. "Looking ain't buying," Earl replied. "Massey, I hear." Earl didn't confirm, didn't deny, just lifted his coffee cup. Walt leaned forward. "You know what your daddy would say about this?" "My daddy's dead, Walt." The table went quiet. That kind of quiet that carries weight, the kind that says a line was crossed and everyone knows it. Walt recovered first. "All I'm saying is that Farmall's got history. You swap it out, you're swapping out more than metal." "I'm not swapping out the tractor," Earl said. "I'm swapping out the engine." That stopped them. 12 men, 12 cups of coffee, 12 sets of eyes turning toward Earl like he'd just announced he was leaving the farm entirely. "Explain," Walt said. And Earl did. He laid out the numbers on a napkin. The cost of a complete engine rebuild on the Farmall, $18,000. The cost of a Massey Ferguson engine crate, adapted to the Farmall chassis, $22,000. The difference, $4,000. But the return, modern fuel efficiency, modern emissions compliance, modern parts availability that wouldn't leave him stranded during planting season. "You're putting a Massey engine in a Farmall?" asked Rick, a younger farmer who'd transitioned to all new equipment 5 years prior. "Best of both worlds," Earl said. "Keeps the chassis my family knows, gets me the power I need to compete." Walt shook his head. "That's a Frankenstein setup, Earl. You know that, right? You're building a hybrid and hoping it survives harvest." "I'm building a solution," Earl corrected. "And I'd rather build my own solution than rent someone else's debt." The conversation ended there, but the talk didn't. By noon, every farmer in the county knew what Earl was planning. By evening, the dealer in town had called to offer alternatives. By the end of the week, Earl's banker had requested a meeting to discuss the financial implications of modifying owned equipment versus purchasing new. Public opinion was split. The older generation saw it as sacrilege, tampering with machinery that had earned its place through decades of service. The younger generation saw it as innovation, practical problem-solving that respected both budget and heritage. But everyone agreed on one thing. Nobody had seen this coming, and nobody knew how it would end. Earl's equipment dealer wasn't opposed to the sale. Far from it. A $22,000 engine order was the kind of transaction that kept service departments staffed and lights on in the showroom. But the dealer, let's call him Tom, had seen this movie before, and he knew how it ended more often than not. "Earl," Tom said, leaning against the counter of his parts department, "I need to tell you something as a friend, not as a salesman." Earl waited. "I've seen 3 guys attempt this swap in the last 10 years. 2 of them ended up selling the whole rig within 18 months. One of them had a catastrophic failure during harvest and lost 40 acres to weather because the machine went down at the wrong time." "I've done my homework," Earl said. "Have you?" Tom pulled a folder from under the counter. "Here's the adaptation kit specs. Here's the mounting bracket tolerances. Here's the hydraulic line routing diagram. You see this measurement right here?" He pointed to a number on the page. "That's a 3mm variance between the Massey engine block and the Farmall mounting points. 3mm doesn't sound like much until you're running at full load and the vibration shakes a bolt loose." Earl looked at the diagram, looked at the numbers, looked back at Tom. "I can machine the brackets," Earl said. "You can, but will you? And if you do, who warrants the work? Because I'll sell you the engine, glad to, but I can't warrant an installation I didn't perform, and if something goes wrong, you're on your own. That was the moment where the decision stopped being about numbers and started being about risk tolerance. Earl could walk away, buy new, get the warranty, get the support, get the peace of mind that comes with factory installation and dealer backing. Or he could proceed, save money up front, accept the risk, bet on his own mechanical ability and the belief that he could make 2 generations of engineering work together. "I'll take the engine," Earl said. Tom didn't argue, didn't try to talk him out of it, just nodded and processed the order. But as Earl walked out of the dealership, Tom made a note in his system. A note that would matter 6 months later when the call came. February in Iowa is not kind to men working in unheated sheds. The temperature rarely climbs above freezing. The wind cuts through coveralls like they're made of paper, and the concrete floor pulls heat from your boots until your toes go numb and stay numb. Earl worked alone, no hired hands, no neighbors offering assistance. This was his decision, and he would carry the labor of it himself. Week 1 was disassembly. The old engine came out in pieces, each one labeled and cataloged. Earl had rebuilt engines before. His father taught him the basics before arthritis took his grip. But this was different. This wasn't restoration. This was transformation. And transformation requires more than mechanical skill. It requires vision. Week 2 was preparation. The Massey engine arrived on a pallet, wrapped in protective coating, smelling of fresh manufacturing and possibility. Earl spent 3 days cleaning the mounting surfaces, checking tolerances, test-fitting brackets that didn't quite align. He machined 2 adapters in his home workshop, welded a custom exhaust manifold connection, fabricated a hydraulic line that didn't exist in any catalog. Week 3 was installation. The engine went in on a Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, it was mounted. By Friday, the connections were complete, and on Saturday, with the sun rising over frozen fields, Earl turned the key. The engine caught on the second crank, idled smooth. No leaks, no unusual sounds, no warning lights. Earl sat in the seat of his grandfather's tractor, listening to a heartbeat that was 60 years old in chassis and 2 years old in power, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. But confidence in farming is a dangerous thing. It's the feeling that precedes the mistake. It's the emotion that makes you push harder than conditions allow. And Earl, like every farmer who's ever lived, would learn that lesson again before the year was out. Planting season arrived in April, later than usual due to a wet spring that kept fields saturated well into the 3rd week. Earl waited, watched the soil moisture levels, consulted the weather forecasts, and when the window opened, a 5-day stretch of dry weather with temperatures climbing into the 70s, he moved. The Farmall Massey hybrid pulled the planter like it had been born to the task. Fuel consumption was down 30% compared to the old engine. Power delivery was smooth. The hydraulics responded instantly. For the first 2 days, everything worked exactly as Earl had calculated. On day 3, a neighbor stopped by. Rick, the young farmer who'd questioned the swap at the coffee shop. He'd heard rumors, wanted to see for himself. "Mind if I take a look?" Rick asked. Earl shut down the engine, popped the hood, let Rick inspect the installation. Rick whistled. "Clean work, better than I expected." "It's holding," Earl said. For now, that word, for now, the kind of qualifier that carries doubt without committing to it. "You think I made a mistake," Earl said. "I think you made a bet," Rick replied. "And bets pay out or they don't. No point arguing before the harvest." Rick left. Earl restarted the engine. And for the next 2 days, the machine performed without issue. 500 acres planted, on schedule, within the weather window. By all measurable standards, the decision had been correct. But farming doesn't reward correctness. It rewards survival. And survival requires more than one successful season. It requires consistency, reliability, the ability to perform when conditions turn against you. Earl would get his test sooner than expected. September arrived with heat that shouldn't have existed in Iowa. Temperatures climbed into the 90s, humidity stayed high, and the corn, stressed by the unusual weather, matured 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Early harvest is a gift and a curse. Gift because you get to market before prices drop. Curse because it compresses the work window and increases the likelihood of equipment failure under sustained load. Earl planned for 7 days of continuous operation, 7 days of running the hybrid from sunrise to sunset, with only brief stops for fuel and maintenance. 7 days that would determine whether the engine swap was a stroke of genius or a catastrophic miscalculation. Day 1, flawless. Day 2, flawless. Day 3, a hydraulic line developed a slow leak. Earl tightened the fitting, continued working. Day 4, the leak returned. Earl replaced the line, lost 4 hours, continued working. Day 5, the engine temperature gauge spiked. Earl shut down, checked coolant levels, found nothing obvious, restarted, continued working. Day 6, the temperature spiked again. This time, Earl made a decision. He called Tom, the dealer. "I need a diagnostic," Earl said. "I'm booked solid through harvest," Tom replied. "You know that." "I've got a temperature issue. Could be nothing. Could be the adaptation causing a cooling system mismatch." There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that says "I told you so" without actually saying it. "Bring it in," Tom said. "But I can't promise turnaround time." Earl brought it in. Tom's service department ran diagnostics, found the issue. The Massey engine's cooling system was designed for a different airflow pattern than the Farmall chassis provided. Under sustained high-load operation, heat built up faster than it could dissipate. The solution: custom baffling, modified shrouding, additional fabrication work. The cost: $3,000. The delay: 5 days. The impact: Earl missed the peak market window. Corn prices dropped 8 cents per bushel during the delay. On his harvest volume, that was a loss of approximately $4,000. The engine swap had saved money up front. But the hidden costs, the fabrication, the downtime, the market timing were catching up. Tom handed Earl the invoice. "I'll waive the diagnostic fee, but the parts and labor are on you." Earl paid. Didn't argue, didn't complain, just signed the check and drove the tractor home. But as he pulled into his yard, he saw something that made his stomach turn. Rick's equipment was in the field next door, still running, still harvesting. Rick had bought new, hadn't had a single downtime incident, and while Earl was waiting for parts and fabrication, Rick was banking checks. The following Monday, Earl's banker requested a meeting. Not unusual, quarterly reviews were standard, but the tone was different, more formal, more concerned. "Earl," the banker said, closing the office door, "we need to talk about your operating note." Earl sat, waited. "The equipment modification wasn't disclosed in your original loan application," the banker continued. "Technically, that's a covenant violation. We finance the farm based on certain asset values. Modifying those assets changes the risk profile." "I didn't modify the collateral," Earl said. "I improved it. From your perspective, from ours, you've introduced uncertainty. If that tractor fails, what's the resale value? Who buys a hybrid? What's the parts availability 5 years from now?" Earl leaned forward. "The tractor runs. It's in the field. It's generating income." "For now," the banker said. The same words Rick had used, the same qualifier, the same doubt. "What do you want from me?" Earl asked. "I want you to understand that your next operating note renewal isn't guaranteed. We need to see a full season of stable operation, no major downtime, no unexpected costs, and we need to see the financials reflect that stability. In other words, prove it. One more season, one more year of performance that justifies the risk, one more harvest without catastrophe." Earl left the bank with a clear understanding. The decision he'd made wasn't just about machinery anymore. It was about credibility, about whether his judgment could be trusted by the people who held the notes on his land. And credibility, once questioned, is harder to rebuild than any engine. The second season, Proof or Failure 2020, arrived with challenges nobody predicted. The pandemic disrupted supply chains, fuel prices fluctuated wildly, labor shortages made it difficult to find hired hands for peak seasons. And through it all, Earl's hybrid tractor worked. Not perfectly, not without issues, but consistently enough to prove a point. The cooling system modification held. The hydraulic lines didn't leak. The engine started every morning, ran all day, and shut down without incident. Earl tracked every hour, every gallon of fuel, every maintenance item. And at the end of the season, the numbers told a story. Total operating cost for the hybrid, $17,000. Estimated operating cost for a new equivalent tractor, $24,000. Savings, $7,000. But the savings weren't the point. The point was reliability. The point was proving that a measured risk, properly managed, could outperform a safe decision that carried its own hidden costs. Rick, the neighbor who'd bought new, had his own challenges. A sensor failure in August cost him 3 days of downtime. A software update in September bricked his display panel for a week. The warranty covered the parts, but not the lost time. And in farming, time is the one commodity you can't buy back. By October, the county had reached a verdict. Not unanimous, not without dissent, but clear enough to matter. Earl Peterson's engine swap wasn't genius, wasn't foolish, wasn't anything except practical. And in a business where practicality determines survival, that was enough. 1 year after the auction that started this journey, Earl attended again. Same location, same crowd, different circumstances. This time, he wasn't just watching, he was selling. The Farmall chassis, with the Massey engine installed, wasn't for sale. But Earl had acquired another piece of equipment through the year, an older combine that needed replacement, and he'd decided to liquidate it rather than invest in repairs. He stood at the back of the crowd and watched as his combine went to the block, sold for a fair price. Nothing spectacular, nothing embarrassing, just a transaction that reflected the reality of the market. Afterward, Walt approached him, the same man who'd questioned the engine swap at the coffee shop 18 months prior. "Heard you're still running that hybrid?" Walt said. "Still running," Earl confirmed. "Any regrets?" Earl thought about the question, thought about the downtime, the fabrication costs, the banker's warning, the stress of harvest when the temperature gauge spiked. Then he thought about the savings, the reliability, the independence of not being tied to a dealer's schedule for every maintenance item, the satisfaction of solving a problem with his own hands. "No," Earl said, "no regrets." Walt nodded, didn't argue, didn't concede, just nodded. And in rural Iowa, a nod from a man like Walt carries more weight than any review or rating. 3 years after the engine swap, Earl Peterson's farm remains operational, not thriving, not expanding, but surviving. And in modern agriculture, survival is its own form of victory. The hybrid tractor has logged over 2,000 hours, required 2 scheduled maintenance intervals, 1 unscheduled repair, a fuel injector replacement that cost $800 and took a single day. Total operating costs remain below the projected costs of new equipment financing. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The numbers don't capture the conversations at the coffee shop, the nods from neighbors who initially doubted, the quiet respect that comes from making a hard decision and living with the consequences. Earl didn't prove that everyone should swap engines, didn't prove that old equipment is better than new, didn't prove anything except this. In farming, the right decision is the one that keeps you in the field, not the one that looks best on paper, not the one that wins arguments, not the one that satisfies pride, the one that works. The Massey Ferguson engine in the Farmall chassis is not a statement. It's not a rebellion. It's not a brand endorsement. It's a solution. And solutions in agriculture are measured in harvests, not headlines. Earl Peterson's story ended without a dramatic conclusion. No bankruptcy, no expansion, no viral moment that changed the industry. Just a farmer who made a decision, lived with it, and proved that practicality can outlast both tradition and innovation when applied with discipline. But the question remains, the question that every farmer watching this story must answer for themselves. When the equipment fails, when the market turns, when the banker calls, what are you willing to bet on? The brand on the hood, the numbers on the page, or the knowledge in your hands? Earl chose the knowledge, and 3 years later he's still in the field. That's not a recommendation, that's not advice, that's just what happened. The rest is up to you.